Hi, my name is Riley, and my parents didn't just betray me. They sold me to a cult leader who convinced them I was their ticket to salvation. For 3 years, I lived as his wife in a compound where questioning meant punishment and escape meant death. But what my parents never knew, what Marcus Thorne never told them, was that I wasn't just another bride. I was a test of how far they'd go to prove their faith, how much they'd sacrifice for promises of eternal reward. And when I finally escaped and confronted them with the truth, when I played the recording that revealed everything, the silence in that courtroom wasn't just shock, it was the sound of a family destroying itself for a lie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever discovered that the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who handed you over to your worst nightmare? Because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty and the price some people will pay for false hope. The morning they drove me to Clearwater Valley, my mother wouldn't stop crying. Not the kind of tears that come from sadness, but the shaky, desperate kind that happen when someone's trying to convince themselves they're doing the right thing. Dad kept his hands locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, radio turned down so low it was just static. I sat in the back seat of our rusted Ford pickup, wearing the white dress Mom had sewn herself, watching Oregon's pine trees blur past like prison bars. I was 19, and I thought I was going to my wedding. The Sacred Harmony community sat tucked into a valley so remote that cell phone towers couldn't reach it, so quiet that you could hear your own heartbeat echo off the mountains. Wooden cabins dotted the landscape like scattered thoughts, each one painted the same shade of cream that Marcus Thorne said represented purity. Gardens stretched between the buildings, perfectly maintained, not a weed in sight. It looked peaceful from the outside, the kind of place city people would pay good money to visit for a weekend retreat. But peace and control can look identical when you're seeing them from the wrong side. Marcus was waiting for us at the main lodge, just like he'd promised. 6'2", salt and pepper beard, eyes the color of winter sky. He wore simple clothes, flannel shirt, dark jeans, boots worn smooth from walking mountain paths, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made you feel small. When he smiled, which he did often, it never quite reached those cold eyes. My parents had been talking about Marcus Thorne for 8 months, ever since they'd driven down to Portland to hear him speak at the Unity Center. They came back changed, talking about divine purpose and spiritual awakening like they'd discovered fire. Our farm equipment business was failing, had been for 3 years, ever since the bigger companies started undercutting our prices and the bank started sending letters with red stamp. Mom worked double shifts at the diner. Dad picked up construction jobs when he could find them, but we were sinking fast. That's when Marcus entered our lives with his promises. Join the community, he said. Dedicate yourselves fully to the spiritual path. And for families who proved their absolute commitment, there would be rewards both earthly and eternal. The earthly part meant debt forgiveness, business opportunities, connections with other community members who had money to invest. The eternal part was salvation itself, guaranteed entrance into what Marcus called the higher realm when the time came. All it required was complete surrender to the divine will, complete surrender to him. Marcus hugged my parents like they were old friends, asked about the drive, commented on how beautiful I looked in my dress. His voice was warm, welcoming, the kind that made you want to lean in closer to hear what wisdom he might share next. He offered us tea, showed us around the grounds, introduced us to other families who'd made the commitment. Everyone seemed happy, content, purposeful. Children played in the meadows while adults tended gardens or worked in the woodshop. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where stress and worry had been replaced by certainty and peace. That should have been my first warning. Real peace doesn't require isolation to survive. The ceremony was simple. Marcus had explained to my parents that traditional weddings were corrupted by materialism and ego, that true spiritual unions needed only intention and witness. We stood in a circle with 12 other community members, holding hands while Marcus spoke about the sacred nature of partnership and the importance of surrendering individual desires for the greater good. My parents watched from the edge of the circle, Dad's arm around Mom's shoulders, both of them crying again but smiling this time. I said yes because I'd been raised to trust my parents' judgment. I said yes because I'd been raised to trust my parents' judgment. Marcus slipped a simple gold band onto my finger, kissed my forehead gently, and whispered that I was home now. The community clapped, someone played guitar, and my parents hugged me like they were saying goodbye forever. Which, as it turned out, that first night, Marcus showed me to his cabin. It was larger than the others, built with hand-hewn logs and furnished simply but comfortably. Books lined the walls, subjects ranging from theology to psychology to agriculture. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and through the back windows you could see all the way to the mountain peaks that surrounded our valley. He made dinner while I sat at the kitchen table, still wearing my white dress, trying to process that this was my life now. He was gentle that first, patient. He explained the community's routines, introduced me to the other wives. There were 7 of them, ranging in age from 22 to 45, and gave me time to adjust. The days had structure: morning meditation at sunrise, communal breakfast, work assignments that rotated weekly, afternoon study sessions, where Marcus would share his insights about spiritual development, evening meals together, and personal time before bed. Everyone had a role, everyone contributed, everyone seemed genuinely committed to the life they'd chosen, but gradually, I started noticing things that didn't fit the peaceful picture. Conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Glances between the older wives that carried meaning I couldn't decode. The way certain community members never seemed to leave the grounds, even for supply runs to the nearest town 40 miles away. How Marcus always knew exactly where everyone was, what they were doing, who they'd spoken with. It wasn't obvious surveillance, more like an invisible web that connected everything back to him. The first time I questioned something directly was 3 weeks after the wedding. During morning meditation, Marcus had spoken about the importance of releasing attachments to the outside world, how communication with former family and friends could contaminate the spiritual progress we were making. I raised my hand, asked if I could call my parents just to let them know I was settling in well. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bone. Marcus smiled, that patient smile he used when someone needed correction. He explained that my parents had been very specific about wanting me to focus completely on my new life, that they understood the transition required cutting certain ties, at least temporarily. He said they'd been proud of my commitment to spiritual growth and didn't want to interfere with my progress. Then he suggested I spend some extra time in contemplation, really examining why I felt the need to reach backward instead of moving forward. That afternoon, I was assigned to work alone in the furthest garden, pulling weeds under the supervision of Grace Winters, one of the older wives. Grace had been with the community for 8 years, had arrived with her teenage daughter who was now married to one of Marcus's assistants. While we worked, I asked her about contact with the outside world. Grace stopped weeding, looked around to make sure no one else was within hearing distance, then told me something that made my blood turn cold. She said families who brought daughters to the community as wives were tested for 3 years to prove their absolute loyalty. During that time, the daughters weren't allowed any contact with their birth family. If the families passed the test, if they showed complete dedication to Marcus's teachings and never questioned the arrangement, then limited contact would be restored. But if they failed, if they showed doubt or tried to interfere, both the families and their daughters would be cut off permanently from the community's support. And since most families who made this arrangement had given up everything to join, being cut off meant losing not just their daughters, but their entire future. The test, Grace whispered, wasn't really about the families at all. It was about training the wives to accept complete dependence on Marcus and the community. By the time 3 years passed, most women had forgotten how to imagine life outside the valley. They'd been broken down and rebuilt in Marcus's image, grateful for his protection, terrified of the world beyond the mountains. Grace's daughter had tried to leave once. 2 years in, Marcus had allowed it, even helped her pack. But he'd also made sure she understood that leaving meant her mother would be expelled as well, left with nothing in a world that had moved on without her. The daughter came back after 4 days, never spoke of leaving again. Now she had 2 children and rarely spoke at all. That night I lay awake next to Marcus while he slept, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what Grace had told me. My parents weren't just gone, They were part of an elaborate test designed to teach me that I belonged to Marcus completely. They'd traded their daughter for promises of salvation and financial security, and now they were being evaluated on how well they could pretend I'd never existed. The rage that built in my chest over the following weeks was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just anger at Marcus for orchestrating this manipulation, but fury at my parents for being willing participants. They'd known, maybe not the details, but they'd known they were giving me away permanently. They'd known and they'd chosen Marcus's promises over their own daughter. But rage, I learned, was a luxury I couldn't afford. Marcus was watching everything, measuring my responses, testing my compliance, just like he was testing my parents. The other wives had learned to hide their feelings so well that sometimes I wondered if they'd forgotten how to feel anything real at all. They moved through their days like sleepwalkers, smiling when expected, nodding during Marcus's lectures, performing their roles with the mechanical precision of people who'd given up hope of being anything else. I realized I had two choices. I could surrender, let Marcus's system break me down until I became another empty shell in a white dress, grateful for his protection, and incapable of imagining freedom. Or I could pretend to surrender while secretly preparing for something else entirely. The pretending was harder than I'd expected. Marcus was skilled at reading people, trained in psychology before he'd started collecting wives and building his isolated kingdom. He could sense resistance, even when it was buried deep, could detect the smallest signs of independent thinking. So I learned to lie with my entire body, to smile with genuine-looking warmth while planning his destruction, to nod enthusiastically during his lectures, while memorizing every detail that might someday be used against him. I volunteered for extra duties, asked thoughtful questions during study sessions, expressed gratitude for his guidance with what appeared to be growing devotion. When he tested my loyalty by giving me opportunities to break small rules, staying up past curfew, keeping an extra portion of food, speaking privately with other wives, I reported these temptations to him myself, asking for guidance about overcoming my selfish impulses. Marcus began to trust me, or at least to believe his system was working on me the way it had worked on so many others. He started including me in planning meetings for community projects, asking my opinions about new families who wanted to join, even sharing some of his private thoughts about the challenges of leadership. He was grooming me to become his lieutenant, the wife who could help manage the others, and I encouraged this development while secretly documenting everything. The community had rules about personal possessions, but Marcus allowed wives to keep journals as long as they focused on spiritual development rather than worldly concern. I filled 3 notebooks with what appeared to be religious reflections and personal growth insights, but written in a code I'd developed based on books I'd read in high school. Between the lines of grateful observations about community life, I was recording names, dates, financial information, details about families who'd been separated, evidence of the psychological manipulation Marcus used to maintain control. 6 months in, I made my first real discovery. While cleaning Marcus's office, I found a locked filing cabinet hidden behind a false panel in his bookshelf. It took me 3 weeks to figure out how to pick the lock without leaving traces, but inside I found records that confirmed everything Grace had told me and were. Marcus kept detailed psychological profiles on every community member, documenting their weaknesses, their triggers, their breaking points. He had financial records showing the exact amounts families had paid to join, lists of business connections who helped funnel money through legitimate-seeming organizations, even correspondence with law enforcement officials who'd been convinced to look the other way when concerned relatives tried to file missing person reports. But the most devastating folder was labeled with my name. Inside were recordings of conversations between Marcus and my parents, starting from their first meeting 8 months before my wedding. I listened to these through headphones during my cleaning shifts, and what I heard shattered any remaining hope I'd held onto about my family's motivations. Marcus had targeted my parents specifically because their financial desperation made them vulnerable to his promises. He'd researched our family for weeks before approaching them, knew exactly how much debt we carried, understood the strain their failing business was putting on their marriage. His initial pitch hadn't mentioned marriage at all, just opportunities for spiritual growth and community support that could help turn their lives around. But gradually, over the course of several recorded conversations, he'd introduced the idea of ultimate commitment. True spiritual development, he explained, required giving up attachments that kept people bound to ego and materialism. For families with daughters of marrying age, the highest form of commitment was allowing those daughters to join in sacred union with the community's spiritual leader. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This wasn't just marriage, Marcus told them. It was a divine calling that would elevate the entire family to a higher spiritual plane. My parents had resisted at first. I could hear the uncertainty in their voices, the discomfort with what Marcus was suggesting, but he was patient, skilled at finding the exact pressure points that would move them from resistance to consideration, to eventual acceptance. He spoke about other families who'd made this commitment and experienced miraculous changes in their circumstances. He shared testimonials from grateful parents whose daughters had found true purpose and happiness as spiritual wives. He gradually convinced them that refusing this opportunity would mean condemning their entire family to continued suffering and spiritual stagnation. The final conversation, recorded just 2 weeks before my wedding, was the one that broke me completely. My father's voice, shaky but determined, asking Marcus to promise that I would be happy, that I would be treated well, that this was truly God's plan for our family. And Marcus's smooth assurance that everything would be exactly as it should be, that their daughter would find peace and purpose beyond anything the outside world could offer, that their sacrifice would be rewarded both in this life and the next. They'd sold me, not for money directly, but for promises of salvation and prosperity that Marcus had tailored specifically to their deepest fears and needs. They'd convinced themselves it was a spiritual calling, but the recordings made clear it was a transaction. Their daughter in exchange for debt forgiveness, business opportunities, and guaranteed entrance into Marcus's version of heaven. I sat in that office, headphones on, listening to my parents discuss the details of giving me away like I was livestock being sold at auction. And something inside me crystallized into diamond-hard determination. I was going to destroy Marcus Thorne. I was going to expose every lie he'd told, every family he'd manipulated, every woman he'd trapped in his mountain kingdom. And I was going to make sure my parents understood exactly what they'd participated in. But first, I had to survive 2.5 more years of being his wife, while gathering enough evidence to ensure he could never do this to anyone else. The pretending became my full-time job, the performance of my life. Every morning, I woke up next to the man who'd orchestrated my imprisonment, smiled at him like he was my salvation, and spent my days building the case that would eventually bring him down. The other wives became my unwitting ally. During our work assignments, I slowly earned their trust by being genuinely helpful and supportive. I never pushed for information directly, but I listened carefully when they shared memories of their former lives, their families, their own journeys to the community. Each story added another piece to the picture of Marcus's systematic predation on vulnerable families. Most of the wives had come from situations similar to mine. Families in financial crisis, facing foreclosure, or bankruptcy, or medical debt they couldn't handle. Marcus offered solutions that seemed like miracles, businesses that suddenly became profitable, debts that mysteriously disappeared, medical bills that insurance companies decided to cover after all, but the price was always the same. Complete commitment to the community, including the surrender of daughters who were old enough to marry. Grace eventually trusted me enough to share more details about the testing process. The families weren't just evaluated on their willingness to give up contact with their daughter. They were also required to recruit other vulnerable families, to donate specific percentages of their newfound prosperity back to the community, to serve as testimonials for Marcus's power to transform lives. They were kept busy with assignments and expectations that made questioning the arrangement nearly impossible. And if they did start to question, if they began to doubt whether they'd made the right choice, Marcus had contingency plans. The prosperity they'd received could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. Business deals could fall through. Debts could mysteriously reappear. Health insurance could be canceled due to bureaucratic error. The message was clear. Their good fortune depended entirely on their continued loyalty to Marcus and acceptance of their daughter's new life. It was a perfect system of control, designed to ensure that even if families eventually had doubts, they'd be too afraid of losing everything to act on those doubts. And for the daughters trapped in the community, knowing that their family's welfare depended on their compliance, created an additional layer of psychological prison. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake in his calculation. He'd assumed that I would eventually break down like the others, that 3 years of isolation and conditioning would transform me into another grateful, dependent wife. He hadn't counted on my rage being stronger than my fear, or my determination to expose him being more powerful than his ability to control me. By the end of my first year, I had enough documented evidence to support multiple criminal charges, but I knew that escaping with just enough evidence to convict Marcus wouldn't be sufficient. I needed to expose the entire system, including the network of accomplices who helped him operate, and the families who'd been complicit in trading their daughters for prosperity. I needed to create a case so comprehensive and damning that no one involved could claim ignorance or plead for mercy based on their own victimization. Most importantly, I needed to record Marcus himself admitting to the true nature of his arrangement with families like mine. All the evidence in the world wouldn't matter if he could convince a jury that he was simply a spiritual leader whose followers had misunderstood his teaching. I needed his own words, captured clearly and undeniably, explaining exactly how he'd manipulated my parents and dozens of other families into participating in his systematic trafficking of their own daughter. That opportunity came during my second winter in the community, when Marcus decided I was ready to help him recruit new families. Marcus began taking me with him to recruitment meetings in neighboring towns, introducing me as an example of the happiness and fulfillment that came from embracing the community's way of life. These trips were my first taste of the outside world since my wedding, and the contrast was jarring. Sitting in coffee shops and community centers, watching normal people live normal lives, made the isolation of Clearwater Valley feel even more suffocating. But these recruitment trips also gave me exactly what I'd been waiting for. Marcus was at his most unguarded during the drive times between meetings, when it was just the two of us in his truck winding through mountain roads. He would debrief about each family we'd met, analyzing their vulnerabilities, discussing which approaches would be most effective for drawing them into the community. He spoke about his work with the casual confidence of someone who'd perfected his system over many years. I always brought a small digital recorder with me on these trips, hidden in a false bottom I'd created in my purse using techniques I'd learned from watching YouTube videos on Marcus's computer during my cleaning duty. He thought I was researching spiritual topics and encouraged my initiative in deepening my understanding of the community's mission. In reality, I was learning everything from lockpicking to digital surveillance, to legal procedures for documenting evidence of human trafficking. The recorder captured hours of Marcus explaining his methodology, how he identified families in crisis through public records, social media, and networks of community contacts, how he approached them gradually, building trust before introducing more radical concepts, how he used psychological pressure techniques to move people from interest to commitment to total surrender. Most importantly, he explained the 3-year testing period in detail, describing it as his most effective innovation for ensuring long-term compliance from both wives and their family. The key, Marcus told me during one particularly revealing drive, is making everyone believe they chose this. The families have to feel like they're making a spiritual decision, not a transaction. The wives have to believe they're finding their true purpose, not being imprisoned. And the community has to see themselves as blessed recipients of divine guidance, not victims of manipulation. Once everyone has invested their identity in the narrative I've created, questioning that narrative becomes psychologically impossible. He was proud of his psychological insights, eager to share his expertise with someone he believed had become his devoted student. He explained how isolation was crucial for breaking down people's ability to think independently, how the structured daily routine eliminated opportunities for reflection or resistance, how the constant focus on spiritual development kept people's attention directed inward rather than toward critical analysis of their circumstance. Your parents, he said during another drive, were perfect candidates. Desperate enough to be open to unconventional solutions, religious enough to respond to spiritual framing, but not sophisticated enough to see through the psychological techniques I was using. They genuinely believed they saved their family by bringing you to me. That belief is so central to their identity now that they'll defend it against any evidence that contradicts it. I made appropriate sounds of understanding and gratitude, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged him to elaborate further. Inside, I was calculating exactly how these recordings would sound to a jury, how Marcus's own words would demolish any defense based on religious freedom or misunderstood intention. He was confessing to systematic psychological manipulation, family separation, and what amounted to human trafficking, all while believing he was educating his most promising protégé. The recruitment meetings themselves were masterclasses in manipulation. Marcus would spend hours with each family, listening to their problems with genuine-seeming empathy, asking probing questions about their fears and hopes, gradually building a picture of their psychological landscape. Then he would tailor his pitch specifically to their vulnerabilities, positioning the community as the solution to whatever crisis they were facing. I watched him work on the Henderson family, farmers from eastern Oregon who were facing foreclosure after 3 bad harvests. Marcus spent 2 hours just listening to their story, asking about their relationship with their land, their pride in their family heritage, their fears about losing everything their grandparents had built. Then he began sharing stories about other farming families who'd found new purpose and prosperity through spiritual commitment, how their connection to the earth had been deepened rather than severed by joining the community. He never mentioned marriage arrangements during initial meeting. That concept was introduced gradually, over multiple sessions, after families had already begun to see him as their salvation. By the time the idea of ultimate spiritual commitment was presented, families were so invested in Marcus's promises that questioning this final requirement felt like rejecting their own rescue. The Hendersons had a 17-year-old daughter named Amy. Sweet girl, homeschooled, devoted to her family, dreaming of studying veterinary science someday. I watched her parents' faces as Marcus eventually explained how families proved their absolute commitment to spiritual transformation, how daughters who embraced sacred union with the community's spiritual leader became conduits for divine blessing that elevated their entire bloodline. The conversation that followed was painfully familiar. The parents' initial shock and resistance, Marcus's patient explanations about transcending worldly attachments, the gradual reframing of their daughter's future from sacrifice to sacred calling. Amy sat quietly through most of it, occasionally glancing at me as if hoping I might offer some alternative perspective. I wanted to scream at all of them to run, to grab Amy and her parents, and drag them away from Marcus's web of lies. Instead, I smiled serenely and shared my own testimony about finding true happiness and purpose through surrender to divine will. I told them how my parents' courage in allowing me to embrace this calling had brought blessings to our entire family, how the love I'd found with Marcus transcended anything the outside world could offer. I watched Amy's face fall as I spoke, saw the resignation creep into her eyes as the adults around her discussed her future like she was a resource to be allocated rather than a person with her own dreams and choices. That night, back at the community, I locked myself in the bathroom and vomited, until there was nothing left. Then I sat on the cold tile floor and promised Amy Henderson that I would find a way to save her, even if it meant destroying myself in the process. The recording from that meeting captured Marcus's entire recruitment strategy in action, including his explanation to me afterward about why the Henderson family would ultimately agree to the arrangement. The daughter is their weak point, he said. They love her so much that they'll convince themselves anything that saves the family must be good for her too. That's the beauty of working with parents instead of approaching the girls directly. The parents do all the psychological work of overcoming resistance. Over the following months, I documented dozens of similar interactions. Marcus was building an empire of broken families, each one contributing daughters and financial support in exchange for promises of salvation and prosperity. The scope of his operation was staggering. In addition to the 7 wives currently at the community, there were 15 other women who'd graduated from the program and now lived in satellite communities throughout the Pacific Northwest, serving as recruiting agents and testimonials for new families. These graduated wives were allowed limited contact with their birth families, but only under strict supervision, and only to reinforce the narrative of happiness and spiritual fulfillment. They would call home occasionally, write carefully monitored letters, sometimes even visit during religious holidays, but their freedom was elusive. They were financially dependent on the community, psychologically conditioned to believe they couldn't survive outside Marcus's protection, and constantly reminded that their family's continued prosperity depended on their ongoing compliance. I learned all this through Grace, who'd been cultivating my trust for months in hopes that I might eventually help her daughter escape. Grace herself was trapped by the knowledge that leaving would mean abandoning not just her daughter but also her elderly mother, whose medical expenses were being covered by the community's health plan. Marcus had structured his system so that every act of apparent generosity created multiple layers of dependence and obligation. "He's not just taking our daughters," Grace whispered to me one evening as we worked alone in the community garden. "He's taking our entire bloodline. My granddaughters will grow up thinking this is normal, that women exist to serve men's spiritual ambitions. By the time they're old enough to question anything, they won't remember that other possibilities ever exist." Grace's words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate about Marcus's long-term strategy. He wasn't just collecting wives for his own gratification. He was building a generational system of control, creating families where female submission and male authority were seen as divine mandates, rather than human choices. The children born in the community would grow up accepting these power structures as natural and inevitable, ensuring that Marcus's system would outlive him and continue expanding long after his death. This realization added urgency to my escape planning. I wasn't just fighting for my own freedom, or even for the current wives trapped in the community. I was fighting for every girl who would be born into Marcus's system, every daughter who would be raised to believe that her highest purpose was serving as someone else's property. The evidence I'd been gathering was comprehensive, but I knew that escaping with documentation wouldn't be sufficient. Marcus had law enforcement contacts who might suppress evidence, legal resources to fight charges, and a network of supporters who would testify to his character and the voluntary nature of community participation. I needed something more powerful than evidence. I needed to create a situation where Marcus's crimes would be exposed so publicly and dramatically that covering them up would be impossible. That opportunity came when Marcus announced that the community would be hosting a gathering for prospective families, a 3-day event where interested parties could experience community life firsthand and make final decisions about joining. He'd organized similar events before, but this one was larger, with families coming from as far away as California and Montana. It would be the perfect opportunity to document his recruitment techniques on a massive scale while also creating witnesses who couldn't be silenced or intimidated. But it would also be dangerous. With so many new people around, security would be tighter, and Marcus would be more alert to potential threats to his carefully controlled environment. If I was caught gathering evidence during the gathering, there would be no opportunity for a second attempt. And if I failed to escape during the chaos of so many visitors, I might never get another chance. The month leading up to the gathering was a delicate balance of preparation and performance. I had to maintain my role as Marcus's devoted wife and trusted assistant, while secretly planning what amounted to an elaborate undercover operation. I volunteered to help with logistics, offering to coordinate housing assignments for visiting families, prepare informational materials, and assist with the various presentations Marcus had planned. Each volunteer assignment gave me access to different aspects of the community's operations. Coordinating housing meant I could map out security procedures and identify potential escape routes. Preparing materials meant I could access Marcus's computer and copying additional files to my hidden storage devices. Assisting with presentations meant I would be present for every major recruitment session, able to record everything while appearing to participate actively in the community's mission. The visiting families began arriving on a Thursday morning in early fall. I stood next to Marcus at the main lodge, welcoming each group with warm smiles and enthusiastic testimonials about community life. Inside, I was memorizing faces, names, details about each family's situation that I could use later to contact them with warnings about what they were really being offered. The Hendersons arrived in the second wave of visitors, Amy looking older and more tired than she had 6 months earlier. Their farm's foreclosure had proceeded despite Marcus's promises of intervention, and they were now living in a rented trailer while her father worked construction jobs and her mother cleaned houses. The desperation in their faces was painful to see, but it also made them perfect targets for Marcus's psychological manipulation. I hugged Amy when her family checked in, whispering that I was glad to see her again. For just a moment, her carefully controlled expression cracked, and I saw the fear beneath her polite smile. She knew what was coming, had known since our first meeting what decision her parents would ultimately make. But she was powerless to resist the economic and psychological pressure that was pushing her toward becoming Marcus's newest wife. That evening, as I helped serve dinner to the visiting families, I activated the recording device I'd sewn into the lining of my dress. The conversations I captured over the next 3 days would provide devastating evidence of Marcus's systematic fraud and manipulation, but they would also document my own complicity in luring innocent families into his web of lies. The first presentation was about spiritual development and community values. Marcus spoke eloquently about transcending materialism, finding purpose through service, and creating authentic connections in a world increasingly dominated by technology and shallow relationships. The visiting families nodded along, clearly moved by his vision of intentional living and mutual support. Nothing he said was technically false, but everything was designed to make his ultimate proposals seem like natural extensions of beautiful principles rather than exploitative demands. The second day focused on practical matters: tours of the gardens and workshops, demonstrations of the community's sustainable living practices, discussions about how new members would contribute their skills and resources to the common good. Again, everything sounded reasonable and appealing. Marcus was careful never to mention the financial requirements, the limitations on outside contact, or the expectation that families would surrender decision-making authority to his leadership. It was only on the third day that the true nature of the arrangement began to emerge. Marcus held private sessions with each family, tailoring his approach to their specific vulnerabilities and needs. I was present for most of these sessions, taking notes, and occasionally offering my own insights about the benefits of complete commitment to community life. The session with the Henderson family was the most difficult to endure. Marcus began by acknowledging their recent hardships, expressing genuine seeming compassion for their losses and fear. He spoke about other families who'd faced similar crises and found not just survival, but transformation, through absolute trust in divine guidance. He shared financial projections showing how their participation in community enterprises could restore their prosperity within 2 years. Then he introduced the concept of ultimate spiritual commitment, not as a requirement, but as an opportunity for families who felt called to the highest levels of spiritual development. He explained how daughters who embraced sacred union with the community's spiritual leader became channels for divine blessing that elevated their entire bloodlines. He shared testimonials from other parents whose daughters had found profound happiness and purpose through this calling. Amy's parents asked the questions I'd heard dozens of times before. Was this really necessary? Couldn't families prove their commitment in other ways? What about their daughter's education, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian? Marcus answered each concern with patient wisdom, gradually reframing their daughter's future from sacrifice to sacred privilege, from loss to gain, from ending to glorious beginning. I watched Amy's face throughout this conversation, saw the exact moment when she understood that her parents were going to say yes, not because they didn't love her, but because Marcus had convinced them that agreeing to his terms was the ultimate expression of that love. They believed they were saving their daughter's soul along with their family's temporal welfare. When the session ended, Amy's parents had committed to bringing their daughter back within the month for her wedding ceremony. They hugged me afterward, thanking me for my inspiring example of how daughters could find joy and purpose through surrender to divine will. Amy said nothing, but she looked at me with eyes that held both accusation and desperate hope, as if she still believed I might somehow intervene to save her. That night was my last opportunity to execute the escape plan I'd been developing for over a year. The gathering would end the next morning, visitors would return to their homes, and security would return to normal level. If I didn't act within the next few hours, Amy Henderson would become the next young woman trapped in Marcus's system of spiritual slavery. I waited until after midnight when the community had settled into deep sleep. The recording devices I'd been using were safely hidden in my escape kit, along with copies of all the documents I'd photographed and notes about law enforcement contacts who weren't part of Marcus's network. I'd memorized the contact information for several families who'd visited over the past year, planning to warn them about what they'd really been offered once I reached safety. The route I'd chosen led through the forest to a logging road about 3 miles from the community building. From there, I could hike to the main highway and hopefully flag down a truck driver or early morning commuter who would take me to the nearest town with a police station. It was risky, but the alternative was watching Amy Henderson and dozens of other young women disappear into the same nightmare I'd been living for nearly 3 years. I slipped out of Marcus's cabin through the back door, moving slowly to avoid triggering the motion sensors he'd installed around the perimeter. The night air was cold against my skin, sharp with the promise of early winter. Pine trees towered above me like silent witnesses, their branches creating a canopy so thick that starlight barely filtered through to the forest floor. But I'd walked these trails hundreds of times during my years in the community, knew every root and rock that might trip me up in the darkness. I moved by feel and memory, following deer paths and creek beds that would mask my footprints, staying well away from the main trails that Marcus's security team patrolled regularly. The forest was alive with small sounds, owls calling from treetops, branches creaking in the wind, small animals moving through the underbrush. Each noise made my heart race, convinced that Marcus had discovered my absence and sent search teams to drag me back. But I kept moving, driven by the image of Amy Henderson's frightened eyes and the knowledge that I might be her only chance at avoiding the fate that had been chosen for her. 3 hours into my hike, I reached the logging road. It was nothing more than 2 tire tracks through the forest, barely visible even in daylight, but it represented the boundary between Marcus's kingdom and the outside world. I paused there for a moment, looking back toward the valley where I'd left behind my wedding ring, my false identity as a devoted spiritual wife, and the carefully constructed performance that had kept me alive for nearly 3 years. Then I turned toward the highway and started walking toward whatever came next, carrying with me enough evidence to destroy Marcus Thorne and the system he'd built on the broken trust between parents and children. The real test would be whether anyone in the outside world would have the courage to listen to what I'd learned and act on it before more families were destroyed by promises of salvation that delivered only separation and control. The dawn was breaking by the time I reached the main highway, painting the mountain peaks in shades of pink and gold that reminded me why I'd once thought Clearwater Valley looked like paradise. Beauty and evil could coexist in the same space, I realized. The trick was learning to see past the surface to the reality beneath, to recognize when something that looked like salvation was actually a carefully constructed trap designed to catch people at their most vulnerable moment. I thought about my parents as I walked along the empty highway, waiting for the first car to appear on the horizon. Were they sleeping peacefully in their debt-free home, grateful for the prosperity Marcus had delivered as promised, or were they lying awake wondering what had happened to the daughter they'd traded for financial security and spiritual promises? Soon I would find out exactly what kind of people they'd become during my 3 years of imprisonment, and they would learn what their choices had cost not just me but every family who'd followed their example in surrendering their daughters to Marcus's vision of divine order. The sound of an approaching engine broke through my thoughts, growing louder as it climbed the mountain road toward me. I stepped into the center of the highway and raised my arms, praying that whoever was driving would have the compassion to stop for a young woman who looked like she'd been walking all night through the wilderness. The truck that pulled over was driven by James Carter, a logger on his way to an early morning job site. He took one look at my torn dress and exhausted face and asked if I needed medical attention. When I told him I just needed to get to the nearest police station, he nodded without asking questions and handed me his cell phone so I could call ahead. "There's a detective in Riverside County who specializes in cult cases," he said as we drove toward town. "Patricia Hay. My cousin worked with her a few years back when his daughter got mixed up with some group down in California. She'll know what to do with whatever you've got." Detective Hayes met us at the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, a small building that looked more like a country store than a law enforcement facility. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen enough human cruelty to appreciate the value of stopping it when possible. I spent the next 6 hours telling her everything I'd experienced and learned during my time in Marcus's community. She listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification about specific detail. When I showed her the recording devices and began playing excerpts from my conversations with Marcus, Her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine alarm. "This is bigger than I thought," she said after hearing Marcus explain his recruitment strategies and testing procedures. "We're not just talking about one isolated community. This is a network, possibly interstate, involving systematic family separation and what amounts to human trafficking. We need federal involvement, and we need it fast." Detective Hayes made a series of phone calls, speaking in the careful language of law enforcement professionals who understand that complex cases require coordination between multiple agencies. While she worked on assembling an investigation team, I used her computer to start documenting everything I could remember about the families I'd met during recruitment trips and community gatherings. The list was longer than I'd expected. Over my 3 years in the community, I'd witnessed Marcus's interactions with more than 40 families. Some had joined the community immediately, others had needed months of cultivation before committing, and a few had ultimately decided against participation. But all of them had been targeted because of their vulnerabilities, and all of them had been subjected to the same careful psychological manipulation, designed to make Marcus's proposals seem like divine opportunities rather than exploitative demand. By late afternoon, Detective Hayes had assembled a team that included FBI agents specializing in religious organizations and human trafficking, prosecutors from both state and federal jurisdictions, and social workers trained in cult intervention and family reunification. The scale of the response told me that my case was being taken seriously, but it also suggested that the investigation would be complex and time-consuming. "We're going to need you to testify," Detective Hayes explained as the team prepared to raid the Clearwater Valley community. "Not just about your own experiences, but about everything you witnessed regarding other families and other victims. This won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Marcus Thorne has resources and connections, and he's going to fight these charges with everything he has." I thought about Amy Henderson, probably sleeping in the community's guest quarters, unaware that her wedding was scheduled for the following week. I thought about Grace Winters and her daughter trapped by financial dependence and psychological conditioning. I thought about all the other women and girls whose lives had been shaped by Marcus's vision of spiritual hierarchy and male authority. "I'm ready," I told Detective Hayes. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes." These families deserve to know the truth about what they've been participating in, and these women deserve the chance to make real choices about their own lives. The next morning, as law enforcement teams prepared to descend on the Sacred Harmony community, I sat in a safe house writing letters to every family I could remember meeting during my 3 years of imprisonment. Each letter began the same way. "You don't know me, but I know what someone you trust has been telling you about salvation and sacrifice. Before you make any irreversible decisions about your daughter's future, there are some things you need to understand about Marcus Thorne and the reality behind his promises." It was time for the parents who'd been willing to trade their daughters for prosperity to learn exactly what kind of deal they'd actually made. And it was time for Marcus to discover that his most devoted wife had been gathering evidence against him from the very beginning, waiting for the right moment to tear down everything he'd built on the foundation of broken families and stolen dreams. The raid on Clearwater Valley happened at dawn, just as the community was gathering for morning meditation. I watched from a surveillance van parked on the ridge overlooking the compound, connected to the tactical team through radio headsets that let me provide real-time guidance about the layout of buildings and the likely locations of evidence. Detective Hayes sat beside me, monitoring multiple communication channels as federal agents, state police, and social workers moved into position around the valley. "All units, this is command," came the voice through our headsets. "Target location secured. No resistance encountered. Beginning systematic search and interview procedures." Through binoculars I could see figures moving between the buildings, some in tactical gear, others in the civilian clothes of social workers and victim advocates. Smoke rose from several chimneys, suggesting that morning routines had been interrupted mid-preparation. I thought about Grace and the other wives, probably confused and frightened by the sudden invasion of their carefully controlled world. Marcus's voice crackled over the radio as agents took him into custody. Even in crisis, his tone remained calm and authoritative, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is a violation of religious freedom," he was saying. "These people chose to be here. They'll tell you themselves that no crimes have been committed." Agent Morrison, the FBI lead on the case, responded with professional detachment. "Mr. Thorne, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, wire fraud, and violations of the Mann Act. You have the right to remain silent." The next several hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed operation. Community members were separated and interviewed individually, their statements recorded and cross-referenced to identify inconsistencies or evidence of coaching. The wives were given special attention, assigned to female agents and social workers trained in cult deprogramming techniques. I provided detailed information about each building's contents, helping agents locate the hidden filing cabinets, encrypted computer files, and recording equipment that Marcus had used to document his operations. My 3 years of careful observation and documentation proved invaluable in ensuring that no evidence was overlooked or destroyed. The interviews with community members revealed the full scope of Marcus's psychological control. Many of the adults genuinely believed they were living in a spiritual community based on voluntary commitment and mutual support. They had no knowledge of the financial arrangements between Marcus and the families who'd brought daughters to the community, no understanding of the systematic manipulation involved in recruitment, and no awareness that outside contact was being deliberately restricted rather than naturally limited. But the wives told different stories. Once separated from Marcus's influence and given time to speak privately with trained counselors, most of them began sharing experiences that painted a clear picture of coercion, isolation, and psychological abuse. They described a community where questioning was discouraged, where contact with the outside world was monitored and restricted, where women's roles were defined entirely by their relationships to male authority figures. Grace was among the first to provide detailed testimony, her 8 years in the community, having given her comprehensive knowledge of Marcus's methods and the experiences of multiple wives over time. She confirmed my account of the 3-year testing period, described the financial arrangements that kept families dependent on Marcus's continued support, and identified other communities where graduated wives had been relocated to serve as recruiting agents. Amy Henderson was found in the guest quarters, dressed in the white ceremonial gown that had been prepared for her wedding ceremony scheduled for the following day. She was physically unharmed but clearly traumatized by months of psychological pressure from both Marcus and her own parents. The social worker assigned to her case immediately began the delicate process of helping her understand that she had choices beyond the ones that had been presented to her. The evidence recovered from Marcus's office exceeded even my expectations. In addition to the files I'd already documented, agents found detailed psychological profiles on dozens of families, financial records showing the flow of money between various community enterprises and individual family accounts, and correspondence with contacts in law enforcement, social service, and religious organizations who'd helped protect Marcus's operations from outside scrutiny. Most damaging were the recordings Marcus had made of his private conversations with community members, including sessions where he explicitly described his manipulation techniques and long-term plans for expanding his network of community. He'd been documenting his own crimes, apparently confident that his psychological control over community members and his connections with outside authorities would protect him from any consequences. By late afternoon, the scope of the investigation had expanded beyond anything Detective Hayes had initially anticipated. Federal prosecutors were identifying potential charges that could result in life sentences. Other law enforcement agencies were opening related investigations in multiple states, and victim advocacy organizations were mobilizing resources to support what could be dozens of women and children who'd been trafficked through Marcus's network. "We're going to need you to testify before a federal grand jury," Agent Morrison explained to me as we reviewed the evidence that had been collected. "Your recordings and documentation provide the foundation for our case, but we need your first-hand testimony about Marcus's methods and the experiences of other victims." I agreed without hesitation, understanding that my testimony would be crucial for ensuring that Marcus faced appropriate consequences and that other potential victims were warned about his operation. But I also knew that testifying would mean facing my parents in a public forum, confronting them with evidence of what they'd participated in, and forcing them to acknowledge the real cost of their choices. The grand jury proceedings took place 3 weeks later in the federal courthouse in Portland. I spent 2 days providing testimony about my experiences in the community, Marcus's recruitment techniques, the systematic nature of his trafficking operations, and the evidence I'd gathered documenting his crime. The prosecutors walked me through each recording, each document, each piece of evidence that supported their case against Marcus and his network of accomplices. The grand jury returned indictments on 17 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Additional charges were filed in multiple states, where Marcus had operated recruiting networks or established satellite communities. The scope of the case had grown to encompass what prosecutors described as one of the largest cult-based trafficking operations ever prosecuted in the United States. Marcus's arrest made national news, with media outlets struggling to understand how a man who'd presented himself as a spiritual leader had managed to operate a sophisticated criminal enterprise for more than a decade without detection. The stories focused on the isolation of his mountain community, the vulnerability of the families he'd targeted, and the psychological techniques he'd used to maintain control over his victims. But what interested me most were the responses from families who'd been involved with Marcus's network. Some expressed shock and disbelief, claiming they'd had no knowledge of any criminal activity and had genuinely believed they were participating in a legitimate spiritual community. Others defended Marcus even in the face of overwhelming evidence, insisting that their daughters had been happy and that the community had provided them with opportunities for spiritual growth that weren't available in the outside world. My parents fell into the second category. In a statement they released through their attorneys, they expressed confidence that the charges against Marcus would ultimately be proven false and that their daughter had been manipulated by law enforcement into making accusations against a man who'd provided their family with spiritual guidance and financial stability. They described me as confused and vindictive, unable to appreciate the blessings that Marcus had brought to our family. Reading their statement felt like being stabbed by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Even with all the evidence of Marcus's crimes, even knowing what he'd done to me and dozens of other women, my parents were still choosing to defend him rather than acknowledge their own complicity in my trafficking. They'd invested so much of their identity in the narrative of being blessed by God through Marcus that admitting the truth would require rebuilding their entire understanding of themselves and their choices. Detective Hayes warned me that this response was common in cases involving cult-like organizations. Families who've been manipulated into participating often become the most vocal defenders of the perpetrators, she explained. Admitting that they were deceived means admitting that they participated in harming their own children. That's psychologically devastating for most parents to accept. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early spring, giving both prosecution and defense teams time to prepare their cases and review the massive amount of evidence that had been collected. Marcus had assembled a legal team that included specialists in religious freedom cases, arguing that his prosecution represented government persecution of alternative spiritual practices and that all community members had participated voluntarily in arrangements they understood and supported. This defense strategy required portraying me and the other wives who'd provided testimony as either delusional or vindictive, women who'd misunderstood the spiritual nature of their commitments and were now seeking revenge against a man who'd tried to help them find purpose and meaning. Marcus's attorneys requested access to my medical records, my educational background, my financial situation, and my relationships with family members, looking for anything that might undermine my credibility as a witness. The prosecution team prepared me for this line of attack during multiple practice sessions, helping me understand how defense attorneys would try to twist my words and questioning my motivations for gathering evidence against Mark. They explained that my 3 years of careful documentation, rather than being seen as evidence of intelligence and determination, would be portrayed as obsessive behavior indicating mental instability. They're going to argue that a psychologically healthy person would have simply left the community if they were unhappy. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh explained. They'll claim that your decision to stay and gather evidence proves that you were actually satisfied with your situation and are only making accusations now because you've been influenced by law enforcement or anti-religious organization. I spent weeks preparing responses to these anticipated attacks, reviewing my recordings and documentation to ensure that I could explain my actions and motivations clearly and convincingly. The evidence was strong, but I understood that Marcus's conviction would ultimately depend on the jury's willingness to believe that seemingly normal families could be manipulated into participating in their own daughter's trafficking. The trial itself began on a cold morning in March, with protesters from religious freedom organizations demonstrating outside the courthouse alongside supporters of trafficking victims and cult survivors. Media coverage was intense, with reporters from national outlets covering what had been dubbed the Mountain Prophet trial by local newspapers. Marcus appeared in court dressed conservatively in a dark suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his demeanor calm and dignified. He looked like exactly what he'd always claimed to be, a spiritual leader who'd dedicated his life to helping troubled families find peace and purpose through faith-based community living. The contrast between his public presentation and the evidence of his crimes was jarring, a reminder of how skillfully he'd crafted his image over the years. My testimony began on the third day of the trial, with Prosecutor Walsh walking me through my background, my family's initial contact with Marcus, and the circumstances that led to my marriage and life in the Clearwater Valley community. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and community members from the various towns where Marcus had recruited family. I described the recruitment process in detail, explaining how Marcus had identified my family's vulnerabilities and tailored his approach to their specific fears and needs. I walked the jury through the gradual escalation of his demands, from initial spiritual commitment to complete surrender of parental authority over their daughter's future. I played excerpts from the recordings I'd made of Marcus explaining his psychological techniques and his view of families as resources to be exploited rather than people to be served. The defense team's cross-examination was aggressive and personal, just as the prosecution had predicted. Marcus's lead attorney, David Richardson, portrayed me as an unstable young woman who'd misinterpreted normal religious practices as criminal behavior. He suggested that my decision to record conversations and gather evidence indicated paranoid thinking rather than legitimate concern about criminal activity. Isn't it true, Miss Davidson, that you were free to leave the community at any time during your 3-year residence there? Richardson asked during one particularly heated exchange. Physically free, perhaps, I replied, but psychologically and emotionally trapped by the knowledge that leaving would result in my family losing their home, their business, and their financial security. Marcus had structured the arrangement so that my compliance was necessary for my parents' survival. Richardson pressed further, trying to get me to admit that I'd enjoyed privileges and respect within the community that I wouldn't have had in the outside world. He suggested that my accusations were motivated by resentment over losing this special status when the community was raided. Mr. Richardson, I said, looking directly at the jury, the privileges you're describing were the privileges of property, not a person. I was valued for my usefulness to Marcus's system, not for my humanity or my individual worth. That's not respect, that's objectification dressed up in spiritual language. The testimony of other wives reinforced my account, with each woman describing similar experiences of isolation, control, and psychological manipulation. Grace's testimony was particularly powerful, her 8 years in the community having given her insight into the long-term effects of Marcus's system on both wives and their children. He didn't just take our freedom, Grace told the jury. He took our ability to imagine freedom. After years of being told that questioning his authority was a sign of spiritual weakness, most of us forgot how to think independently. We became grateful for small mercies, appreciative of basic human dignities that should have been our rights all along. The prosecution also called several families who'd been approached by Marcus, but had ultimately decided against joining the community. Their testimony revealed the pressure tactics he'd used when families showed reluctance, including threats that refusing his guidance would result in spiritual and financial consequences that could destroy their lives. One father described receiving anonymous letters warning that his business partnerships would be terminated if he continued to resist Marcus's offers of spiritual guidance. Another family testified that their health insurance had been mysteriously canceled after they decided not to pursue community membership, forcing them to choose between medical care and financial security. The evidence of Marcus's broader network was perhaps most damaging to his defense. Federal agents testified about discovering communities in 4 other states where similar operations were being conducted, all connected through financial transfers and communication networks that traced back to Marcus's organization. The scope of his criminal enterprise far exceeded what any individual community could have supported, revealing a sophisticated operation that had been trafficking women and defrauding families across multiple jurisdictions for more than a decade. Expert witnesses in cult psychology explained to the jury how Marcus's techniques were specifically designed to overcome normal human resistance to exploitation. Patricia Hayes, the detective who'd first believed my story, testified as an expert in religious manipulation and family separation, explaining how perpetrators like Marcus used legitimate spiritual concepts as tools for psychological control. The victims in these cases aren't weak or gullible people, Dr. Hayes explained to the jury. They're often intelligent, caring individuals who've been targeted during periods of crisis when their normal judgment is compromised by stress and desperation. The perpetrator's skill lies in identifying these vulnerable moments and providing solutions that seem miraculous but come with hidden costs that aren't revealed until victims are already too invested to escape easily. The defense team's case relied heavily on character witnesses who testified to Marcus's positive impact on their lives and their communities. Former community members described him as a devoted spiritual leader who'd helped them overcome addiction, financial problems, and family conflict. They insisted that their participation in community life had been entirely voluntary, and that they'd never witnessed any criminal behavior. Marcus himself took the stand in his own defense, presenting himself as a misunderstood religious leader who'd been persecuted for practicing alternative forms of spirituality. He denied any criminal intent, claiming that all arrangements with families had been clearly explained and freely accepted. He portrayed the wives' testimony as the result of coaching by law enforcement officials who were determined to destroy his community regardless of the truth. "I devoted my life to helping families find spiritual peace and economic stability," Marcus told the jury during his direct examination. "The young women who joined our community as spiritual wives were cherished and protected, given opportunities for growth and service that the secular world couldn't provide. Their accusations are the result of outside manipulation by people who don't understand or respect our religious practice." But Marcus's composure cracked during cross-examination, when Prosecutor Walsh confronted him with his own recorded words describing families as resources and wives as assets in his expanding network. The recordings revealed a man who spoke about human beings in terms of their utility to his organization, who calculated the psychological pressure needed to overcome resistance, who planned the systematic exploitation of vulnerable families with the cold precision of a business strategist. Thorne, Walsh asked during one particularly devastating exchange, "When you described the Henderson family's daughter as perfect breeding stock in your recorded conversation with Mrs. Davidson, were you referring to her spiritual qualities or her biological utility to your organization?" Marcus's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury had heard his own voice reducing a 17-year-old girl to her reproductive capacity, revealing the calculating mindset behind his spiritual rhetoric. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with both sides summarizing their cases for a jury that had listened to 3 weeks of testimony about psychological manipulation, financial fraud, and systematic human trafficking. Prosecutor Walsh focused on the evidence of Marcus's criminal intent and the testimony of multiple victims who'd described identical patterns of control and exploitation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh concluded, "this case isn't about religious freedom or alternative lifestyle. It's about a sophisticated criminal who used spiritual language to disguise a trafficking operation that destroyed families and enslaved young women." The defendant's own words, recorded by one of his victims, reveal his true motivations and methods. "We ask you to hold him accountable for the crimes he committed against these families and to send a message that religious rhetoric cannot be used as a shield for criminal behavior." The defense's closing argument portrayed Marcus as a victim of religious persecution, prosecuted by a government that didn't understand or respect unconventional spiritual practices. Richardson argued that all community members had participated voluntarily in arrangements they understood and supported, and that the prosecution's case was based on misinterpretations and manipulated evidence. "My client is not a criminal," Richardson told the jury. "He's a spiritual leader who dedicated his life to helping troubled families find peace and purpose." The young women who lived in his community were not victims but willing participants in a religious lifestyle that offered them meaning and security. This prosecution represents the worst kind of government overreach, using the power of the state to destroy a man whose only crime was practicing his faith in a way that makes some people uncomfortable. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 17 federal charges. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same calm demeanor he'd displayed throughout the trial. But several of his supporters in the courtroom began crying, apparently still unable to accept that the man they'd trusted with their spiritual development had been systematically exploiting them for his own benefit. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving the prosecution time to prepare victim impact statements and the defense time to present mitigation evidence. The federal sentencing guidelines suggested that Marcus could face life in prison without the possibility of parole, reflecting the scope of his crimes and the number of victims who'd been harmed by his operation. "I spent those 6 weeks working with victim advocates to support the other women who'd been trafficked through Marcus's network, helping them navigate the legal process and connect with resources for rebuilding their lives outside the communities where they'd been held. Many of them struggled with basic decisions that most adults take for granted, having spent years in environments where all choices were made by someone else." The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for victims to address the court directly, describing the impact of Marcus's crimes on their lives and their families. "I was among 12 women who chose to provide impact statements, using the opportunity to ensure that the judge understood the full scope of the harm Marcus had caused. Your Honor," I said when my turn came to address the court, "Marcus Thorne didn't just steal 3 years of my life, he stole my family, my sense of safety, my ability to trust my own judgment about people and situations. He convinced my parents to trade their daughter for promises of prosperity and salvation, then structured his system so that my suffering was necessary for their continued well-being. The psychological damage from that betrayal will take years to heal, if it ever heals completely." I went on to describe the impact on other victims, the children who'd grown up believing that female submission was divinely mandated, the families who'd been destroyed by choices they'd made based on Marcus's lies. I asked the judge to impose a sentence that reflected not just the crimes Marcus had committed, but the ongoing harm his system continued to cause even after his arrest. Grace testified about watching her daughter grow up in an environment where questioning male authority was treated as a spiritual defect, where her granddaughters were being raised to see themselves as future property rather than independent human beings. Amy Henderson's parents, who'd finally begun to understand what they'd almost participated in, described the guilt and shame they felt about nearly surrendering their daughter to Marcus's system. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Chen, imposed the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines, life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences on the fraud and racketeering charges. In her sentencing statement, Judge Chen emphasized that Marcus's crimes represented a fundamental violation of the trust between religious leaders and their followers, and that the spiritual rhetoric he'd used to disguise his criminal behavior made his offenses particularly heinous. "Ms. Thorne," Judge Chen said as she imposed the sentence, "you used people's faith as a weapon against them, exploiting their trust and their desperation to build a criminal empire that destroyed families and enslaved young women. Your actions represent the worst kind of abuse of spiritual authority, and the harm you've caused will continue affecting your victims for the rest of their lives. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and I hope that your incarceration provides some measure of justice for the people whose lives you destroyed." Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his calm facade finally cracking as the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison settled over him. Several of his supporters continued to insist that he'd been wrongly convicted, that religious persecution had triumphed over justice. But for the victims who'd testified against him, the sentence represented validation that their experiences mattered and that the crimes committed against them would not be ignored or minimized. The conviction and sentencing made national news again, with legal experts praising the prosecution's success in securing justice for trafficking victims, while also respecting legitimate religious freedom concerns. The case became a model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar cult-based criminal organizations, demonstrating how careful documentation and coordinated law enforcement efforts could overcome the psychological and legal protections that such groups typically employ. But for me, the real test would come in the weeks and months following Marcus's sentencing, when I would have to confront my parents directly and force them to acknowledge what they'd participated in. The legal system had validated my experiences and held Marcus accountable for his crime. Now I needed to discover whether my family was capable of accepting the truth about their choices and working towards some form of reconciliation, or whether their investment in Marcus's narrative was so complete that our relationship couldn't be salvaged. The conversation I'd been dreading for nearly 4 years was finally unavoidable. It was time to sit across from the people who'd raised me and ask them to explain how they'd convinced themselves that trading their daughter for promises of prosperity was an act of love rather than an act of betrayal. The meeting with my parents was arranged through their attorney, a small-town lawyer who specialized in agricultural law and seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the federal case that had consumed his client's life. They insisted on meeting at his office rather than at their home, a detail that told me everything I needed to know about their expectations for our conversation. This wasn't meant to be a family reunion or a step toward reconciliation. This was damage control, an attempt to manage a situation that threatened their carefully constructed narrative about their choices. I arrived at the law office on a gray Thursday morning in late spring, carrying a briefcase full of documents that I hoped might penetrate the wall of denial my parents had built around themselves. Detective Hayes had offered to accompany me, but I'd declined. This confrontation needed to happen without the presence of law enforcement officials who might be seen as coercive influences. My parents needed to face the truth about their choices without being able to claim that they were being intimidated or manipulated by authority. The office was exactly what I'd expected from a rural attorney who handled farm disputes and property transfer. Wood-paneled walls lined with law books that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades, a desk covered with stacks of papers held down by paperweights shaped like farm animals, and family photos showing the lawyer at various community events over the year. It was the kind of place where people came to handle routine legal matters, not to confront the destruction of their family relationships. My parents were already seated when I arrived, positioned on opposite sides of a small conference table with their attorney between them like a referee. Mom looked older than her 53 years, her hair showing more gray than I remembered, and her face marked by lines that suggested months of stress and sleepless nights. Dad sat rigidly upright, his work-worn hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested he'd prepared for this meeting like it was a business negotiation rather than a conversation with his daughter. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I'd imagined this moment countless times during my years in Marcus's community, but none of my fantasies had captured the awkwardness of sitting across from people who'd once been the most important figures in my life and now felt like strangers who happened to share my DNA. Finally, their attorney cleared his throat and began speaking in the careful language of someone trying to prevent his clients from saying anything that might be used against them later. He explained that my parents wanted to express their love for me and their hope that our family could find a way to move forward despite the misunderstandings that had developed around Marcus's case. He emphasized they had acted in what they believed were my best interests and continued to believe that their decisions had been motivated by genuine concern for my welfare and spiritual development. I listened to this carefully crafted statement without interruption, recognizing the hand of legal counsel in every phrase. My parents weren't here to acknowledge wrongdoing or express remorse for their choices. They were here to maintain their version of events while attempting to minimize the damage to their relationship with their only daughter. Even now, even after Marcus's conviction on 17 federal charges, they were still choosing to protect their narrative rather than confront the reality of what they'd participated in. When the attorney finished his prepared remarks, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder, the same device I'd used to capture Marcus's confessions during our recruitment trips together. I placed it on the table between us and pressed play, filling the wood-paneled office with the sound of my father's voice from 4 years earlier, asking Marcus to promise that I would be happy in my new life. The recording was devastating in its clarity. Every word of the conversation where my parents had finalized the arrangements for my marriage was preserved, including their questions about financial benefits, their concerns about maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by relatives, and their explicit agreement that contact with me would be severed for at least 3 years to ensure my complete integration into Marcus's community. Mom began crying before the recording finished, but they weren't tears of remorse or recognition. They were tears of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were being dismantled by undeniable evidence, someone who was being forced to confront truths they'd spent years avoiding. Dad's expression didn't change, but his hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly, the only sign that he was processing what he was hearing. When the recording ended, I played a second one. This time it was Marcus's voice explaining to me how he'd identified my family as ideal targets, how he'd researched our financial situation and tailored his approach to exploit my parents' specific vulnerability. He described their psychological profiles with the clinical detachment of a predator who'd studied his prey, noting their religious backgrounds, their financial desperation, and their willingness to make extreme sacrifices, if those sacrifices could be framed in spiritual terms. The third recording was perhaps the most damaging. It captured Marcus explaining his 3-year testing system, describing how families were evaluated based on their willingness to abandon their daughters completely, and how that abandonment was used as a tool for ensuring the daughter's psychological dependence on the community. He spoke about my parents specifically, praising their commitment to the testing process and their success in resisting outside pressure to contact me during my first 2 years in the community. By the time I finished playing the recordings, the office felt like a tomb. The attorney was staring at his legal pad, apparently recognizing that his client's situation was far worse than he'd understood. Mom was sobbing quietly, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks. Dad was still staring straight ahead, but his face had gone pale and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Those recordings were taken out of context," Dad finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus was explaining spiritual concepts that civilians wouldn't understand. He was trying to help us see beyond our earthly attachments to our daughter's eternal welfare. I'd expected this response, but hearing him maintain his delusions, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, still felt like a physical blow. After everything that had been revealed during the trial, after Marcus's conviction on multiple federal charges, after hearing his own voice confirming his participation in trafficking his daughter, my father was still choosing to believe Marcus's lies rather than acknowledge the reality of what he'd done. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "Marcus is spending the rest of his life in prison for trafficking young women like me." The federal government, after investigating his operations for months, concluded that he was running a criminal enterprise designed to exploit vulnerable families. "At what point does the evidence become too overwhelming for you to ignore?" The attorney tried to intervene, probably recognizing that his clients were about to say things that could complicate their already precarious legal situation. But Mom spoke before he could stop her, her words tumbling out in a rush of emotion and desperation. "You don't understand what it was like," she said through her tears. "We were losing everything. The farm equipment business was failing. We were behind on mortgage payments. Your father was working 16-hour days just to keep us from losing the house. When Marcus came along and offered us a way to save our family, we saw it as a miracle. God was providing for us through his servant, and all we had to do was trust in divine providence." "And what about me?" I asked. "What about your daughter's right to choose her own path, to make her own decisions about marriage and motherhood and the direction of her life? When did you decide that my autonomy was an acceptable price to pay for your financial security?" Dad's composure finally cracked. "We thought you'd be happy," he shouted, his face flushing red with emotion. "Marcus promised that you'd find purpose and meaning that the secular world couldn't provide. He said you'd be cherished and protected, that you'd become part of something greater than yourself. We believed we were giving you opportunities, not taking them away." I pulled out another document from my briefcase, a copy of the psychological evaluation that had been prepared for Marcus's sentencing hearing. The evaluation detailed the long-term effects of cult involvement on victims, including difficulty trusting their own judgment, problems forming healthy relationships, and ongoing struggles with feelings of worthlessness and abandonment. I read sections of it aloud, describing how my 3 years in Marcus's community had affected my ability to function in normal society. "This is what your decision cost me," I said when I finished reading. "Not just 3 years of my life, but potentially decades of psychological damage that I'll have to work to overcome." Marcus didn't cherish and protect me. He used me as a tool for controlling other families and expanding his criminal operation. Every day I spent as his wife was a day I spent trapped in a system designed to strip away my identity and my ability to imagine alternatives. The attorney tried again to redirect the conversation toward less damaging territory, suggesting that we focus on moving forward rather than relitigating past decisions. But I wasn't finished. I had one more piece of evidence that I'd been saving for this moment, something that would make it impossible for my parents to maintain their narrative about acting in my best interest. I pulled out a bank statement from the account Marcus had set up for families who'd successfully completed their 3-year testing period. The statement showed regular deposits, totaling more than $200,000, payments that Marcus had made to my parents over the course of my imprisonment. The payments weren't described as compensation for my marriage or as payment for surrendering parental rights. They were listed as spiritual consultation fees and community support contributions, carefully crafted language designed to provide legal cover for what amounted to purchase payments for their daughter. "This is what you were paid for me," I said, sliding the bank statement across the table. $200,000 over 3 years, deposited into an account that Marcus helped you set up specifically for this purpose. You weren't just agreeing to let me marry a spiritual leader. You were selling me to a trafficker and receiving regular payments for your compliance with his demands. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad stared at the bank statement like it was written in a foreign language, his face cycling through expressions of shock, denial, and growing horror. Mom's crying became more intense, her sobs echoing off the wood-paneled walls of the attorney's office. Even the lawyer seemed stunned by the revelation, apparently unaware that his clients had received financial compensation for their daughter's marriage. "We didn't know," Mom finally whispered. "Marcus said those payments were to help us rebuild our business, to ensure that we could maintain the lifestyle that would be appropriate for the spiritual leader's in-laws. He never said we were being paid for you specifically." "Look at the dates," I said, pointing to the bank statement. "The payments started the day after my wedding ceremony and continued every month until the day Marcus was arrested. They stopped the moment he could no longer use me to demonstrate to other families that his system worked, that parents who surrendered their daughters would be rewarded for their faith and obedience." Dad picked up the bank statement with shaking hands, studying the dates and amounts like he was seeing them for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe Marcus had structured the payments in such a way that my parents hadn't fully understood their connection to my situation. But the evidence was undeniable. They had been financially compensated for surrendering their daughter to a man who'd used her for psychological manipulation and sexual exploitation. "We thought God was blessing us for our obedience," Dad said quietly. "Our business started turning around. We were able to pay off debts that had been crushing us for years. We had financial security for the first time in decades." Marcus said these blessings would continue as long as we maintained our faith and trusted in divine providence. I felt a mixture of pity and rage, listening to him try to maintain his self-deception, even in the face of documentary evidence. They had received regular payments for surrendering their daughter to a criminal, but they'd convinced themselves that these payments were divine blessings rather than transaction fees. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain this fiction was staggering, but it also explained how they'd been able to sleep at night while their daughter was being held in an isolated compound by a man who controlled every aspect of her life. The attorney finally found his voice, probably recognizing that his clients had just admitted to receiving substantial payments in connection with what federal prosecutors had proven was a human trafficking conspiracy. He tried to end the meeting, suggesting that further discussion would be better handled through formal legal channels, rather than family conversations that might complicate ongoing investigations. But I wasn't ready to let my parents escape back into their bubble of denial and self-justification. I had one final recording that I'd been saving for this moment, something that would make it impossible for them to claim ignorance about the true nature of their arrangement with Mark. The recording was from my second year in the community, when Marcus had called my parents to discuss my progress and their continued compliance with the testing requirement. During the conversation, Marcus explicitly described the psychological techniques he was using to break down my resistance and ensure my complete dependence on his authority. He spoke about isolating me from outside influences, restricting my access to information, and using positive reinforcement to reward compliance with his demands. My parents' voices on the recording showed that they understood exactly what Marcus was describing. They asked questions about my psychological state, expressed concern about whether the isolation was too severe, and requested reassurance that the techniques being used wouldn't cause permanent damage to my mental health. But they never asked him to stop. They never demanded to with me directly. They never threatened to withdraw their support if he didn't modify his approach. Instead, they asked how they could help ensure the success of his psychological manipulation. They offered to provide information about my childhood experiences that Marcus could use to identify my emotional triggers. They agreed to maintain complete silence about my existence when questioned by concerned relatives or family friends. They committed to serving as testimonials for other families who might be considering similar arrangements. When the recording ended, the office was completely silent except for the sound of Mom's muffled crying and the ticking of an old clock on the attorney's desk. The evidence was complete and undeniable. My parents hadn't just agreed to let me marry Marcus, they had actively participated in the psychological destruction of their daughter, providing him with tools and support that made his manipulation more effective. "You sold me," I said quietly, looking directly at each of them in turn. "Not just my body or my future, but my mind and my soul. You helped him break me down systematically, and you took payments for your assistance in destroying your own daughter's ability to think independently or imagine alternatives to the life he'd chosen for me." Dad tried one more time to frame their actions in terms of spiritual obedience and parental sacrifice, but his words sounded hollow even to him. The recordings had revealed the calculating nature of their participation in Marcus's system, their willingness to prioritize financial benefits over their daughter's welfare, and their active collaboration in psychological techniques designed to strip away my autonomy and identity. "We loved you," Mom said through her tears. "We still love you. We were trying to do what was best for our family, for all of us. Marcus convinced us that this was God's plan for your life, that refusing would mean condemning you to spiritual and material poverty. You chose money over your daughter," I replied. "When Marcus offered you financial security in exchange for surrendering me to his control, you took the deal. Everything else is just rationalization designed to help you sleep at night." The meeting ended shortly after that, with the attorney hastily escorting his clients out of the office while mumbling about scheduling follow-up discussions through proper legal channels. My parents left without trying to hug me or arrange future contact, apparently recognizing that our relationship had been irreparably damaged by the revelations of their complicity in my trafficking. I sat alone in the attorney's office for several minutes after they left, processing the reality that my family was truly gone. Not just absent, but actively choosing to maintain their delusions rather than acknowledge the harm they'd caused. The people who'd raised me, who'd taught me about love and loyalty and moral responsibility, had revealed themselves to be capable of selling their daughter when the price was right, and the justifications were sufficiently compelling. Detective Hayes called me that evening to check on how the meeting had gone. I described the recordings I'd played and my parents' responses, their continued denial despite overwhelming evidence of their participation in Marcus's trafficking operation. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me process the emotional impact of confronting people who'd chosen money and self-preservation over their daughter's welfare. "Are you considering pressing charges against them?" she asked when I finished my account of the meeting. "The evidence you've gathered suggests they were active participants in Marcus's conspiracy, not just naive victims who were manipulated into making bad decisions. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks, weighing my desire for justice against the reality that prosecuting my own parents would be emotionally devastating regardless of the outcome. They were clearly guilty of participating in my trafficking, and their financial compensation made it impossible to argue that they'd been innocent victims of Marcus's manipulation. But they were also my parents, the people who'd raised me and shaped my understanding of the world, and pursuing criminal charges would represent a final severing of whatever remained of our family relationship. I need time to think about it, I told Detective Hay. Part of me wants them to face consequences for what they did, but part of me just wants to move on and build a life that doesn't revolve around seeking justice for past wrong. The decision about whether to pursue charges against my parents ultimately became moot when federal prosecutors announced that they were expanding their investigation to include family members who'd received financial compensation for participating in Marcus's trafficking network. The bank records I'd obtained were apparently just the tip of the iceberg, with investigators discovering similar payment arrangements involving dozens of families across multiple states. My parents were among 12 family members who were indicted on federal conspiracy charges 6 months after Marcus's sentencing. The charges carried potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in prison, reflecting the government's determination to hold all participants in trafficking networks accountable for their choices regardless of their familial relationships to victims. The trial of the family members was scheduled for the following spring, giving me most of a year to decide whether I wanted to testify against my parents, or try to maintain some form of neutrality that might preserve the possibility of future reconciliation. It was an impossible choice, forcing me to choose between seeking justice for the crimes committed against me and maintaining whatever remained of my connection to the people who'd raised me. During this period, I worked with victim services organizations to support other young women who'd been trafficked through similar networks, helping them navigate the legal system and connect with resources for rebuilding their lives. The work was emotionally challenging but also healing, providing me with a sense of purpose that came from using my experiences to help others avoid similar exploitation. I also began working with a therapist who specialized in cult recovery and family trauma, trying to process the complex emotions surrounding my parents' betrayal and my own role in exposing their crime. The therapeutic process was slow and difficult, requiring me to confront not just what had been done to me but also my own feelings of guilt about the consequences my actions had brought upon my family. It's normal to feel conflicted about your parents facing criminal charges, my therapist explained during one of our sessions. Even when people have harmed us severely, we often maintain emotional attachments that make their suffering painful for us to witness. Your feelings don't change the reality of what they did or the importance of holding them accountable. The therapy helped me understand that my parents' prosecution wasn't really about revenge or punishment, but about establishing legal and social standards that would protect other families from similar exploitation. If parents could surrender their children to traffickers without facing consequences, as long as the transactions were framed in religious or spiritual terms, then the legal system would be sending a message that family relationships could be used as shields for criminal behavior. As the trial date approached, I made the decision to testify against my parents, not because I wanted to see them imprisoned, but because their crimes deserved to be exposed and acknowledged. The other victims of Marcus's network needed to see that all participants in trafficking operations would be held accountable regardless of their relationships to victims or their claimed motivation. The testimony I provided was factual and restrained, focusing on the evidence of my parents' active participation in Marcus's conspiracy rather than the emotional impact of their betrayal. I described their financial compensation, their collaboration in psychological manipulation techniques, and their ongoing support for Marcus's operations, even after learning about the harm being caused to their daughter. My parents' defense team portrayed them as naive victims who'd been manipulated by a sophisticated criminal into making decisions they didn't fully understand. They emphasized my parents' rural background, their limited education, and their religious faith as factors that made them vulnerable to Marcus's psychological technique. They argued that prosecution of grieving parents whose daughter had been trafficked represented government overreach and would discourage other families from cooperating with law enforcement in similar cases. But the evidence of financial compensation and active collaboration was too strong to overcome with appeals to sympathy or claims of ignorance. The jury convicted both parents on conspiracy charges after deliberating for less than 6 hours, apparently concluding that receiving regular payments for surrendering a daughter to a known trafficker constituted criminal behavior regardless of the defendant's claimed motivations or religious beliefs. Dad was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Mom received 18 years, with the judge citing her apparent greater emotional distress during the trial as a mitigating factor. Both sentences reflected the serious nature of their crimes while acknowledging that they were less culpable than Marcus himself for the overall trafficking operation. The sentencing hearing provided my final opportunity to address my parents directly to explain how their choices had affected not just my life, but my understanding of family loyalty and parental responsibility. I used the victim impact statement to describe the ongoing psychological effects of their betrayal, the difficulty of trusting people or forming healthy relationships after learning that the people who'd claimed to love me most had been willing to sell me for financial gain. Your Honor, I concluded, looking directly at my parents for the first time since their conviction, I don't hate them for what they did. I understand that they were struggling financially and that Marcus was skilled at exploiting people's vulnerability, but their actions taught me that love isn't enough to protect children from harm if that love is conditional on economic circumstances or religious manipulation. I hope their sentences serve as a warning to other parents that their children's welfare must take precedence over their own financial struggles or spiritual ambitions. My parents were led away in handcuffs, just as Marcus had been months earlier. Mom was crying again, but Dad maintained the same rigid composure he'd shown throughout the trial, apparently still unable or unwilling to acknowledge the full scope of his choices and their consequences. I left the courthouse that day knowing that my family was truly gone, not just absent, but actively destroyed by choices that had prioritized money and religious manipulation over the welfare of their daughter. The legal system had provided justice in the form of criminal convictions and lengthy prison sentences, but it couldn't restore the relationships that had been destroyed by Marcus's system or heal the psychological wounds that would affect me for the rest of my life. But I also left with a sense of closure that came from knowing that the truth had been exposed and acknowledged, that the crimes committed against me and other victims had been properly investigated and prosecuted, and that the legal precedent established by these cases would help protect future victims from similar exploitation. Justice had been served even if it couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. Walking out of that courthouse for the final time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in nearly 5 years. The weight of complete freedom, not just physical freedom from Marcus's compound or legal freedom from ongoing court proceedings, but the psychological freedom that comes from knowing that every person who'd participated in my trafficking had been held accountable for their choice. The truth had been exposed, documented, and validated by multiple juries. There was no longer any question about what had happened to me, or who was responsible for making it happen. But freedom, I discovered, came with its own challenge. After years of fighting for justice and working toward convictions, I suddenly found myself without a clear mission or purpose. The legal battles that had structured my life since escaping from Clearwater Valley were over. Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison. My parents would be incarcerated for the next 2 decades. The other family members who'd participated in the trafficking network had been sentenced to terms ranging from 8 to 15 years. The question now was what to do with the rest of my life, how to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my family and the trauma of my experience. I was 25 years old, had been out of normal society for nearly 4 years, and possessed skills and knowledge that weren't exactly marketable in conventional employment context. I could pick locks, analyze psychological manipulation techniques, and document criminal evidence with professional precision. But I had no college degree, no work history that didn't involve either cult membership or law enforcement cooperation, and no clear sense of what I wanted to become. The victim services organizations that had supported me through the legal proceedings offered ongoing counseling and assistance with practical matters like finding housing, applying for educational programs, and developing job skills. But they also made it clear that their resources were limited, and that I would eventually need to transition to independence without the intensive support I'd received during the investigation and trials. Dr. Sarah Kim, the therapist who'd been working with me since my escape, helped me understand that this transition period was normal for trafficking survivors, but also uniquely challenging for people whose cases had involved such extensive legal proceedings. Most survivors have to rebuild their lives, while the people who harmed them remain free and unpunished, she explained during one of our sessions. You've had the unusual experience of seeing complete justice served, which provides closure but also removes the external structure that gave meaning to your recovery process. She was right about the loss of structure. For years, my days had been organized around legal meetings, court appearances, evidence review sessions, and victim impact preparations. I'd had clear goals, specific tasks, and a sense of purpose that came from working toward justice for myself and other victims. Now I was facing the prospect of creating a normal life without the dramatic framework of seeking accountability for serious crimes. The first challenge was practical, finding a place to live and a way to support myself financially. The Victim Compensation Fund had provided enough money to cover basic expenses during the legal proceedings, but those payments would end within 6 months. I needed to develop employable skills and find work that wouldn't trigger the psychological issues that still affected my ability to trust authority figures or function in hierarchical environments. I enrolled in community college courses, starting with basic requirements while exploring different fields that might provide career paths suited to my interests and abilities. The transition back to formal education was more difficult than I'd anticipated. Sitting in classrooms with teenagers who'd never experienced anything more traumatic than failed relationships or academic pressure made me feel ancient and disconnected from normal social development. But I persisted, driven by determination to prove that Marcus hadn't permanently damaged my ability to learn and grow. I discovered an aptitude for psychology and criminal justice, subjects that allowed me to channel my experiences into academic understanding of the systems and behaviors I'd encounter. My professors were initially puzzled by papers that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of cult psychology and trafficking investigations, but they gradually learned to appreciate the unique perspective I brought to theoretical discussion. The academic work also connected me with other students who were interested in social justice issues, people who were passionate about protecting vulnerable populations and reforming systems that enabled exploitation. These friendships developed slowly, built on shared interests rather than shared trauma, and helped me remember what normal social relationships could feel like. One of these friends was Michael Torres, a psychology major who was planning to pursue graduate work in forensic psychology with a focus on religious manipulation and cult recovery. He'd grown up in a family that had been approached by recruiters from a different cult-like organization, and his parents' decision to reject their overtures had sparked his interest in understanding how such groups operated, and how families could be protected from their influence. Michael never pushed for details about my experiences, but he clearly understood that I had personal knowledge of the subjects we studied together. When I finally shared some of my story with him, his response was thoughtful and supportive rather than shocked or pity. He saw my experiences as valuable expertise rather than simply traumatic history, and his perspective helped me begin to see myself as someone who had survived and overcome rather than someone who had been permanently damaged. Our relationship developed gradually over 2 years of shared classes and study sessions, built on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility rather than romantic intensity. Michael understood that I needed time and space to develop trust, and he never pressured me to move faster than felt comfortable. When we finally began dating seriously, it was because I felt ready to explore emotional intimacy with someone who knew my history and accepted it as part of who I was rather than something that needed to be overcome or forgotten. During this period, I also maintained contact with other survivors from Marcus's network, particularly Grace and her daughter Emma, who had been among the first wives to testify against him. Grace had struggled more than I had with the transition to independence, partly because she was older and had spent 8 years in the community, but also because she felt overwhelming guilt about her role in her daughter's trafficking. Emma, now 24, had initially been angry with me for destroying the only life she'd known, and forcing her to confront the reality of her situation. The community had been her entire world since age 16, and learning that her marriage and motherhood had been orchestrated by a criminal rather than chosen freely was psychologically devastating. She spent months in intensive therapy, working through feelings of betrayal, confusion and grief for the life she'd believed she was living. But gradually Emma began to understand that my actions had given her the opportunity to make real choices about her future rather than simply accepting the role that Marcus had assigned to her. She enrolled in online education programs, earned her high school equivalency, and began taking college courses while working part-time and raising her 2 young children. Her progress was inspiring and reminded me that recovery was possible even for people who'd spent their entire adult lives in Marcus's system. Amy Henderson, the teenager whose family I'd encountered during recruitment meetings, became another important connection during my transition period. Her parents had been so horrified by the revelations about Marcus's true nature that they'd undergone their own extensive therapy to understand how they'd been manipulated into nearly surrendering their daughter to a trafficker. They'd become advocates for other families who'd been approached by similar organizations, working with law enforcement and victim services to identify and disrupt recruitment efforts. Amy herself had struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion about her family's near participation in Marcus's network, but she'd channeled those feelings into academic achievement and social activism. She was studying social work with the goal of helping other teenagers whose families were being targeted by exploitative organizations. Her determination to transform her experiences into tools for protecting others reminded me of my own journey from victim to advocate. Working with these other survivors helped me understand that recovery wasn't a destination but an ongoing process, and that healing happened differently for everyone depending on their circumstances and resources. Some survivors struggled with trust issues that made forming relationships difficult. Others dealt with educational gaps that limited their employment options. Many faced financial challenges that made independent living stressful and precarious. But all of us shared the experience of having to rebuild our identities from the ground up, figuring out who we were when we weren't defined by our relationships to Marcus or our roles in his system. It was liberating but also terrifying, like being handed the keys to a life you'd never been trained to drive. 2 years after my parents' sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from my mother. She was writing from the Federal Women's Correctional Facility where she was serving her 18-year sentence, and her letter represented the first communication I'd received from either parent since their conviction. The letter was carefully written, probably reviewed by prison counselors or legal advisors, but it seemed to represent a genuine attempt at acknowledging the harm she'd caused. Mom wrote that she'd been participating in therapy programs designed to help inmates understand the impact of their crimes on victims and their family. She described the process of gradually accepting responsibility for her choices, rather than continuing to blame Marcus for manipulating her into decisions she hadn't fully understood. She acknowledged that she'd prioritized financial security over my welfare, and that her actions had caused me psychological harm that couldn't be undone by apologies or expressions of regret. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest that we should attempt to rebuild our relationship. Instead, it focused on accepting responsibility and expressing genuine remorse for choices that had destroyed our family. Mom wrote that she understood if I never wanted to see or hear from her again, but that she wanted me to know that she recognized the full scope of what she'd done and was working to become someone who would never make similar choices again. I spent weeks deciding how to respond to the letter, discussing it extensively with Dr. Kim and with Michael, who'd become my closest confidant and support system. Part of me wanted to maintain complete separation from my parents, to treat them as strangers who'd committed crimes against me rather than family members who deserved consideration. But another part of me was curious about whether genuine change was possible, whether the people who'd raised me could actually transform themselves into individuals capable of prioritizing their children's welfare over their own interests. Eventually, I wrote a brief response acknowledging her letter and expressing cautious appreciation for her willingness to accept responsibility for her actions. I made it clear that I wasn't ready for regular correspondence or visits, but that I was open to receiving updates about her progress in therapy and personal development. It was a tentative first step toward the possibility of future reconciliation contingent on evidence of genuine change rather than just expressions of regret. Dad never wrote to me, and I learned through victim services contacts that he was struggling more than Mom with accepting responsibility for his choices. He'd apparently become involved with a prison ministry that encouraged him to see himself as a victim of religious persecution, rather than a perpetrator of crimes against his daughter. The cognitive dissonance between his self-image as a loving father and the reality of his actions was apparently too great for him to resolve through honest self-examination. This difference in their responses to incarceration helped me understand that recovery and growth weren't automatic consequences of facing consequences for harmful behavior. Some people used punishment as an opportunity for genuine reflection and change, while others doubled down on the justifications and denial mechanisms that had enabled their original choices. My parents were diverging in their responses to accountability, with Mom gradually accepting reality while Dad retreated further into delusion. During my third year of college, I began working part-time with a nonprofit organization that provided services to cult survivors and families affected by religious manipulation. The work involved everything from crisis counseling and legal advocacy to educational presentations and policy development. It was emotionally challenging but also deeply meaningful, allowing me to use my experiences and knowledge to help other people navigate situations similar to what I'd survived. One of my primary responsibilities was developing educational materials for parents about how to recognize and respond to cult recruitment efforts targeting their family. The materials emphasize the importance of maintaining open communication with children, the warning signs of exploitative organizations, and the resources available for families who found themselves being pressured to make extreme commitments in the name of spiritual development. This work brought me into contact with families who were currently dealing with cult involvement, including parents whose adult children had joined groups similar to Marcus's organization, and children whose parents were being recruited by manipulative leaders. Each case was unique, but the patterns of psychological manipulation and family separation were depressingly similar across different groups and geographical locations. I also testified before state legislative committees that were considering bills designed to strengthen protections against religious trafficking and improve support services for survivors. These appearances required me to share details of my experiences in public forums, but they also provided opportunities to influence policy development and ensure that legal systems were better equipped to handle similar cases in the future. The legislative work was particularly satisfying because it represented a way to transform my personal experiences into systemic changes that could protect other families from similar exploitation. Laws that had been inadequate to prevent my trafficking were being strengthened based partly on evidence from my case and testimony about the gaps in existing protection. Michael and I became engaged during my final year of college, planning a small ceremony that would focus on our commitment to each other rather than the family traditions that had been so corrupted in my own experience. We decided to build our own version of family based on mutual respect, open communication, and shared values rather than trying to recreate relationships that had been damaged beyond repair. Our wedding was attended by the chosen family I'd assembled over the years of recovery, other survivors who'd become close friends, victim advocates who'd supported my journey toward justice, college friends who'd accepted my history without judgment, and mentors who'd helped me develop new skills and perspectives. Grace and Emma were both there, representing the bonds formed through shared trauma and mutual support. Kim attended as well, marking the transition from therapeutic relationship to personal friendship built on years of honest communication and professional respect. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, focused on vows we'd written ourselves that acknowledged our individual histories while committing to a future based on honesty, growth, and mutual support. We exchanged rings that we'd chosen together, symbols of commitment that belonged to us rather than traditions that had been imposed by others. It was everything that my forced marriage to Marcus had not been: freely chosen, mutually desired, and based on genuine knowledge and acceptance of each other. After college, I enrolled in graduate school to pursue a master's degree in social work with a specialization in trauma recovery and family system. The advanced education would qualify me for clinical practice and supervisory roles in victim services organizations, expanding my ability to help other survivors while also providing financial stability and professional recognition. Graduate school was challenging in different ways than undergraduate work had been. the clinical training required me to confront my own psychological issues more directly while also developing skills for helping other people navigate similar challenges. Learning to maintain professional boundaries while drawing on personal experiences for clinical insight was a delicate balance that required ongoing supervision and self-reflection. But the work was also deeply rewarding, particularly when I began seeing clients who were dealing with cult involvement or religious trauma. My personal experiences provided credibility and understanding that purely academic training couldn't match, while my professional education gave me tools and frameworks for helping people that pure experience alone wouldn't have provided. One of my most memorable clients was Jennifer Walsh, a young woman whose parents had been approached by recruiters from an organization that used tactics nearly identical to Marcus's method. Jennifer's family had resisted the initial recruitment efforts, but the pressure had been increasing over several months, and her parents were beginning to waver under promises of financial relief and spiritual enlightenment. Working with Jennifer and her family required me to apply everything I'd learned about cult psychology and family dynamics while also managing my own emotional responses to situations that closely paralleled my own experience. The case was successful in that the family ultimately decided to cut contact with the recruiting organization and seek support for dealing with the psychological manipulation they'd experienced. But it also reminded me that Marcus's methods were still being used by other predators who'd learned from his example or developed similar techniques independently. 5 years after my escape from Clearwater Valley, I received news that Marcus had died in prison. He'd apparently suffered a heart attack during his sleep, ending his life at age 58, after serving less than half of his life sentence. The news prompted complex emotions: relief that he could never harm anyone else, disappointment that his death might prevent other victims from coming forward or receiving justice, and a strange sense of closure that came from knowing his story had truly ended. The death also prompted reflection on how much my life had changed since our paths had first crossed. I was now 28, married to someone who respected and supported my independence, professionally trained to help other survivors, and psychologically stable in ways that would have seemed impossible during my years in his community. I'd built a life based on my own choices rather than someone else's manipulation, surrounded by people who valued my autonomy rather than my compliance. But Marcus's death also reminded me that the systems and attitudes that had enabled his crimes were still present in society. Religious authority was still being used to justify exploitation, families were still vulnerable to manipulation during times of crisis, and legal protections were still inadequate to prevent sophisticated predators from targeting vulnerable populations. My work with the nonprofit organization had expanded to include training programs for law enforcement officials, helping them recognize and investigate cult-related crimes more effectively. Too many cases were still being dismissed as family disputes or religious freedom issues, rather than being properly investigated as potential trafficking or fraud. Education and advocacy were gradually improving responses, but progress was slow and uneven across different jurisdictions. I'd also begun writing about my experiences, working on a book that would provide detailed information about cult recruitment and manipulation techniques, while also telling the story of my survival and recovery. The writing process was emotionally difficult but also therapeutic, allowing me to organize my experiences into a coherent narrative that might help other people understand and respond to similar situations. The book project brought me into contact with other survivors and researchers who were working to document and analyze the full scope of cult-related crimes in the United States. Their work revealed that Marcus's organization had been just one of dozens of similar groups operating across the country, many of them using identical techniques for targeting vulnerable families and trafficking young women under the guise of religious marriage arrangements. Some of these organizations were still operating, having learned from Marcus's mistakes about documentation and communication security. They were more careful about leaving evidence trails, more sophisticated in their legal protections, and more effective at isolating their victims from potential sources of help. The challenge for law enforcement and victim advocates was staying ahead of these evolving tactics, while also supporting survivors of groups that had already been disrupted. My mother's letters had become more frequent and more substantive over the years, documenting her progress in therapy and her growing understanding of the psychological processes that had led to her choice. She'd completed multiple treatment programs, earned her GED while incarcerated, and become a mentor for other inmates who were struggling to accept responsibility for their crime. Her letters showed genuine growth and self-reflection rather than just expressions of regret or attempts to minimize her culpability. After extensive consultation with Dr. Kim and careful consideration of my own emotional readiness, I agreed to visit Mom in prison during her 6th year of incarceration. The visit was scheduled for 2 hours in a supervised setting with counselors available if the conversation became too difficult for either of us to handle. Seeing her in person after more than 6 years was jarring. She looked older than her 60 years, her hair completely gray and her face marked by lines that suggested years of stress and reflection. But her eyes were clearer than I remembered, less clouded by the desperate self-deception that had characterized her during the trial. She seemed to have developed a quiet dignity that came from accepting responsibility for her actions, rather than continuing to fight against the reality of what she'd done. Our conversation was careful and limited, focusing on her progress in therapy and her understanding of the harm she'd caused rather than attempting to rebuild the relationship we'd once had. She asked about my education and career, expressing pride in my accomplishments while acknowledging that she'd forfeited any right to claim credit for my success. She shared details about her daily life in prison, her work in the library, and her participation in programs designed to help inmates develop empathy and accountability. Most importantly, she asked what she could do to support my healing and recovery, acknowledging that traditional expressions of parental love were no longer appropriate given what she'd done. I told her that her continued work in therapy and her willingness to accept responsibility were the most meaningful contributions she could make, both for me and for other families who might benefit from understanding how cult recruitment had succeeded in her case. The visit lasted the full 2 hours, and we parted with an understanding that future contact would depend on her continued progress and my own comfort level with rebuilding limited connection. It wasn't reconciliation in any traditional sense, but it was an acknowledgement that people could change and that even severely damaged relationships might eventually accommodate some form of cautious interaction. I never visited my father, who'd apparently continued to blame outside influences for his incarceration rather than accepting responsibility for his choices. His letters to Mom, which she occasionally mentioned, apparently still contained references to religious persecution and government overreach. The cognitive dissonance between his self-image and his actions remained too great for him to resolve through honest self-examination. On my 30th birthday, Michael and I celebrated with the chosen family we'd assembled over the years of recovery and growth. Grace and Emma were there, both thriving in their own journeys toward independence and healing. Amy Henderson attended, now a practicing social worker who specialized in helping teenagers whose families were being targeted by exploitative organizations. Dr. Kim came as well, representing the professional support that had made my recovery possible. The celebration was simple but meaningful, focused on gratitude for survival and growth, rather than mourning for what had been lost. I'd learned to measure my life by what I'd built rather than what had been destroyed, by the relationships I'd chosen rather than the ones that had been imposed on me, by the work I was doing to protect others rather than the harm that had been done to me. Looking back on the decades since my escape from Clearwater Valley, I could see a clear trajectory from victimization through justice to recovery and purpose. Each phase had been necessary and valuable, building on the previous one while preparing for the next. The legal battles had provided validation and accountability. The therapeutic work had enabled psychological healing. The educational and professional development had created new identity and purpose. The advocacy work had transformed personal experience into tools for protecting others. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that recovery didn't mean forgetting or forgiving what had been done to me. It meant refusing to let those experiences define the limits of what I could become or accomplish. Marcus had tried to reduce me to a tool for his manipulation of other families. My parents had treated me as a commodity to be traded for financial security, but I'd reclaimed my autonomy and used it to build a life based on my own values and choices. The work continues. There are still families being targeted by predators who use spiritual authority to justify exploitation. There are still young women being trafficked under the guise of religious marriage arrangements. There are still legal and social systems that need to be reformed to better protect vulnerable populations from sophisticated manipulation. But there are also more survivors speaking out, more advocates working to reform inadequate systems, more law enforcement officials trained to recognize and investigate cult-related crimes. The progress is slow and sometimes frustrating, but it's real and meaningful. Each family that's protected from recruitment, each survivor who's supported through recovery, each predator who's held accountable for their crimes, represents a victory against the systems that enabled my own trafficking. I share my story not for sympathy or admiration but as a reminder that survival is possible, that justice can be achieved, and that even the most sophisticated forms of manipulation can be overcome by persistence, courage, and appropriate support. The people who tried to destroy my autonomy and identity ultimately failed because they underestimated my capacity for resistance and growth. For anyone who recognizes elements of their own situation in my story, know that escape is possible, that you deserve better than what you're being offered, and that there are people and organizations prepared to help you reclaim your freedom and rebuild your life. The path isn't easy, but it's worth taking. Your life belongs to you, not to anyone who claims authority over your choices in the name of family loyalty, religious obedience, or spiritual development. The silence they demand is their weapon. Your voice is yours to reclaim. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.